Okay, wonderful. So I think we can get started here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce today's workshop, Providing Services for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender LGBTQ Students. We're excited to welcome Alex Polk and Brandon Robinson, who are presenting today. My name is Mary, and I am this workshop's monitor. I'm here to make the workshop run smoothly, so please reach out to me via the chat in the virtual platform if you have any questions. First, I just want to go over a couple housekeeping items. You will be muted during the presentation. You will find the chat function on the session page on the events platform. We encourage you to use this to engage during the session and ask any questions. You can also easily take notes right on the platform if you would like to by selecting the notes button at the top right of the screen. You can also export these notes after the session. If you want to see more full screen options, select theater mode at the bottom of the live stream window. This will allow you to see the slides, the person speaking, and the chat and polls option. If there are any tech issues or for some reason you get signed out of the workshop, please email the support team. I will drop that email into the chat right after I finish this introduction. Finally, at the bottom of the workshop, please complete the workshop survey. You can find the link at the bottom of the session page. So this is important for everyone who is looking for CEU credit. So that's all for housekeeping items. So now I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers who will tell us a little bit about themselves. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Brandon Andrew Robinson. I'm a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Riverside, though I got my PhD in sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. So I'm very familiar with Texas and life in Texas. And my research focuses on LGBTQ youth homelessness in Central Texas. My study took place in Austin and in San Antonio. In my forthcoming book, which I'll present a few things from during my part of talking today, is called Coming Out to the Streets, which is again about LGBTQ youth homelessness in Central Texas. And there's a flyer for a 30% discount for anyone who might be interested in purchasing the book at the end of the session. Thank you all, and I'll turn it over to Alex.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Polk. I'm a communications specialist at T-Noise, and I'll kind of share a little bit about how I got started with T-Noise. Just a moment. So, I got started with T-Noise because I was homeless, living in a transitional living program with LifeWorks, and I was meeting with my counselor, and my counselor was really inspired by my story. And she said that it would be really cool if I did some talks on my story. And that's kind of how I got started with T-Noise and got introduced to them. I was doing talks and started sharing my perspective, and I found it really empowering for myself. And eventually T-Noise allowed me to join their annual conference 3 years ago. And from there, I've just developed my, my work in doing this, and it's been so fulfilling for me. I grew up in New Braunfels, Texas, so not too far from here. Some of you may be from that area, so hello. So on this, T-Noise has provided me many opportunities to share my story and advocate on behalf of LGBTQ youth. And so I'm really excited to share my story here today. An important piece of T-Noise work is centering and elevating youth voice, and there are many ways that youth can get involved in our work. Our youth engagement roadmap shows many opportunities available for youth, from interviews, focus groups, and joining our young adult leadership council, which I was also a part of, and just other like general stuff. From that point, you can get into board positions like I did, and upward. So there's lots of room for youth voice, and you can also take this time to get involved. I help manage the social media, and so you guys can follow us on our social media. I'm there pretty often, and subscribe to our newsletter as well. So, welcome to our workshop. I kind of want to open up this conversation, and just because I'm curious, if you guys are comfortable putting in the chat what your pronouns are. My pronouns are listed. My pronouns are he, him. And so I want to open up this conversation with kind of a question: what are your pronouns? So you guys can put that in the chat while I blabber on. So with this workshop, it's an opportunity to learn and grow. You're going to take this information and hopefully influence your students and your LGBTQ students in a really positive way. I'm going to provide some really basic LGBTQ 101, as well as some trans 101, and then I'll kind of go in and chit chat about some very specific things that I think would benefit you guys to know about your students and what it's like being LGBTQ. And then we'll go over best practices, and then we'll have about 15 minutes to go for a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout, I'd say go ahead and hold those questions, and then we can ask those at the end of our session. And then I'll be providing some references and helpful referrals. But first, let's reflect. This conversation can be kind of intense, not necessarily in my perspective, but I'd say take this time to do some self-reflection if your views don't necessarily align with the topics being shared. This is a great point to just take a step back, really listen to the words being shared, and acknowledge the voices of our youth. And this is my experience, and my experience alone, my trans experience, and it's up to Brandon if they want to go into their own experience, and especially the youth that they've worked with. And so kindness is key. I want to acknowledge your personal beliefs. And my personal goal for this workshop is that at least one service provider, one teacher, one parent can take some of this knowledge and help impact a LGBTQ plus youth positively in their life. At least one, at least. So now let's go into some terms and definitions. The first one being LGBTQ. That acronym will get stuck in my mouth all day, so bear with me. I'm gonna do my best to try to help myself through it. So that's an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer and or questioning. So the Q in LGBTQ can be used interchangeably between queer and questioning. Sexuality is an emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people, while gender is the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors of that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. Gender identity is one's innermost concept of self as man, woman, a blend of both or neither, and how individuals believe or perceive themselves and what they call themselves. Gender expression is one's appearance, dress, and behavior. So the disparities between those, so gender is, what you identify, or what you feel you are. Gender identity is your own concept, your self-concept of yourself, and then how you go about expressing your gender identity is up to that individual person. The next one being gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is clinically significant distress caused when a person's assigned birth gender is not the same as the one in which they identify. So the American Psychiatric Association recently came out with some information regarding gender dysphoria and how to identify a person as transgender. So it's come out recently that you don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans. However, a lot of trans people do experience gender dysphoria, myself included. Gender expansive is an umbrella term sometimes used to describe people that expand notions of gender expression and identity beyond what is perceived as the expected gender norms. So under this umbrella would be gender queer, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, and etc., non-binary as well. And I actually created a document with all the disparities between those identities, because I know that sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. When I first started getting into the queer space, I was kind of confused personally, and so I had to do some research on it. And so I've made a quick, easy document for you guys to see the different definitions and disparities between those gender expansive identities. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. So I'm transgender. I use the term trans to describe myself. And cisgender is a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. So you hear trans people saying that if you're a cis straight person, that means you're a cisgendered straight person. So cis and trans are kind of like the opposites of each other, I suppose. Another term and definition could be transsexual. It's an older medical term used to describe people whose gender identity and birth assigned sex do not match. This was previously used, this was the previous term to the term transgender, and some older trans folks tend to use this term. Younger trans folks can also use this term as well to describe them, but it's a pretty outdated term and not something to be used nowadays. If a trans person self-identifies as this, then you can definitely respect that, but it's not something that most people use nowadays. Queer is a term often used to express fluid identities and orientations, often used interchangeably with LGBTQ. Questioning is a term used to describe people who are in the process of exploring their sexual orientation or gender identity. Intersex is an umbrella term used to describe a wide range of bodily variations. In some cases, these traits are visible at birth, and in others, they are not apparent until puberty. Some chromosomal variations of this type may not be physically apparent at all. So this is whenever you hear LGBTQIA+, intersex is the I in LGBTQIA. Closeted describes an LGBTQ person who's not disclosed their sexual identity or orientation. This is where the term, you're in the closet, I'm in the closet, that's where that comes from. And so outing. Outing is exposing someone's lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender identity without their permission. So I'll kind of go into a brief short story about this. I was outed by my stepmom to my father when I was in high school, and I was a freshman in high school whenever my dad found out that I was gay. I wasn't trans. I didn't realize I was trans yet necessarily, but I remember getting off of school and I was in my girlfriend's car, and I got a call from my mom, my birth mom, and she said, hey, you might not want to go home yet today because your dad's waiting on the porch and he wants to talk to you. So at that point in my youth, I was just like, I need to shut everything about all of my relationships from my family. And so I became really self-isolated, and I would just run home. I'd run up the stairs, I'd go in my room, I'd close that door, and I didn't come out until absolutely necessary. And so that kind of later on translated to me being, when was it? I was a sophomore in high school when I realized I was transgender. And I actually realized I was trans my sophomore prom, which was kind of inconvenient personally. But my stepmom had outed me to my dad as trans after I was dealing with a period of temporary blindness caused by my medical conditions. And so my stepmom took my phone while I was on morphine, sick in bed, blind, and she read through my phone and found out that I was trans and told my dad. At that point, I grew up in a cult, so things were really intense for me as far as religion goes, and there's a lot of religious trauma behind that. But my dad sent me to conversion therapy for several months after I was put on disability at school, and they used that disability as a means to get me out of school for several months to attend conversion therapy to get me better. And ultimately, that would have stopped me from graduating like dead in my tracks if I didn't get through the program as quickly as possible, kept my head down, followed the curriculum, and just get through to survive until I came back. And unfortunately, this was a very similar experience for my little sister who's queer, except she was 13 and she was in middle school, and she was outed by a teacher to my father. And, that year she was gone for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, and I couldn't contact her because for whatever reason, my dad felt like I was influencing her to be who she was. And so I'll pass this off to Brandon on that note.
Thanks, Alex. So although we have kind of all these great terms that Alex has given us in these wonderful definitions, I now also want to kind of complicate our understanding of gender and sexuality. And so although we often teach gender and sexuality as differently, that gender is often who you go to bed as a man, woman, non-binary, genderqueer, another gender identity. And sexuality, we often say, is who you go to bed with, heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, or asexual, or another sexual identity. These categories often actually intertwine and are actually much more complicated than this division that we have. And indeed, they often intertwine in how we read them on other people's bodies, but also with many of the youth that I work with, and perhaps many of the youth that you all work with, they might use these terms of gender and sexuality interchangeably as well. So for instance, we often read or assume someone's sexuality based on their gender expression. So if someone embodies or enacts an expansive expression of gender, such as a boy wearing fingernail polish, many people might view this child as gay or is going to grow up to be gay. So that is, we often see this gender, this feminine boy, and then make an assumption about sexuality. So this is kind of where gender and sexuality complicate one another. And in turn, we might try to police this boy's behavior as a way to try to prevent him from becoming or being gay. That is, gender policing, or how we try to make boys be masculine and girls be feminine, is often also about trying to regulate their sexuality, or about trying to also make the child be or become heterosexual. And this gender policing can happen through social sanctions, such as bullying, which is one of the most common, of course, for LGBTQ youth in schools, and through physical violence or other social sanctions that happen. And these social sanctions aim to uphold the gender binary of masculine men and feminine women, as well as heterosexuality as natural and correct. But the fact that we are constantly monitoring and policing each other, as well as monitoring and policing our own gender presentation and sexuality, shows that there's nothing natural or innate about this, or we wouldn't have to be policing each other's behaviors all the time. Furthermore, sociologist C.J. Pascoe gives us this concept of gender homophobia, where she was examining heterosexual boys in high school and how they would use homophobia not to disparage gay people, but to police each other's masculinity. So she often found that if these boys, if one of their friends, another boy, was acting feminine, they would call him a fag. And that this wasn't necessarily, most of these boys were like, I'm not homophobic, I have gay friends, but they used homophobia to police each other's own masculinity. So that we have to further see that sometimes, again, homophobia might not be specifically about discriminating against LGBTQ people, though of course it has that effect on LGBTQ people by hearing the word fag at school, but that it might also be about gender policing. So this is, again, where kind of gender and sexuality become intertwined. And as I said, for many of the OWN youth in my study on LGBTQ youth homelessness, they often use gender and sexuality terms interchangeably, as well maybe the youth and children that you all work with. So one moment, many youth in my study would identify as heterosexual trans women. So these are, trans women who are attracted to men, but the next moment they might call themselves gay, they might talk about fagging out. As Alex mentioned, many trans youth would come out as non-heterosexual first, and then once they learned about trans identities, they would then identify as heterosexual trans people. So there's all these kind of shifting ways that gender and sexuality can work in people's lives that kind of complicate often the categories that we have. So although we often maybe talk about gender and sexuality in simpler terms that seem to make them be two different things, they often intertwine in how we both experience these social categories ourselves, but also how we experience people policing our gender and sexuality. So as the next slide then discusses on intersectionality, these experiences of gender and sexuality intertwine as well with race and class. So intersectionality is an analytical framework that examines how systems of power interconnect, shaping our experiences of privilege, oppression, and of course our material realities. That is, race and class influence how we experience our gender and sexuality and influence how LGBTQ people experience being LGBTQ. For example, race and class can shape experiences of homophobia. Poverty makes it harder for poor LGBTQ people to avoid violent contexts, where middle-class LGBTQ people might have more resources to access safer spaces, such as gay straight alliances, or perhaps private restrooms that might not be available to poor LGBTQ people, especially LGBTQ people living on the streets who often cannot access violent spaces. Also, LGBTQ people of color often perceive homophobic violence from other LGBTQ people as not just a punishment about them being LGBTQ, but also as a way of punishing them for betraying their racial group, for being LGBTQ. So they experience this not just as homophobic violence, but also intersecting with their racial group and their racial identity. And in her work on sexual nonconforming Latinas, sociologist Katie Acosta also documents how mothers accept the non-heterosexuality of their Latina daughters, but they wanted their daughters to be feminine. They said, you can be a lesbian, but we need you to be feminine. Because they feared that their Latina daughters, if they were masculine, would automatically be read as non-heterosexual, and therefore they would experience more discrimination in a world that they already have to navigate as brown women. And so there's all these different ways that race and class shape and impact how people experience their gender, sexuality, and being LGBTQ. And so now getting more into these disparities that Alex has up about how these social categories then of race, class, gender, sexuality intersect to deeply impact certain LGBTQ people's lives. So in my own study, and as many studies have shown, LGBTQ youth comprise at least 40% of the youth homelessness population, despite them only comprising about 5 to 8% of the overall youth population. So LGBTQ youth disproportionately make up the youth homelessness population in this country. And I can talk more about why during the Q&A if people are interested in that. That's much more complicated than the family rejection narrative that we often hear. And these challenges, and of course these are disproportionately Black and brown LGBTQ youth making up this population because of how racism and poverty intersect to push certain youth to the streets. And these challenges are often exacerbated for trans and gender expansive youth experiencing homelessness who have to navigate the gender segregation of shelters and services while also facing other obstacles such as trying to obtain an ID card and clothing that aligns with their gender identity and gender expression. There's also an overrepresentation of LGBTQ people in jails and in prisons. Lesbian, gay, bisexual people experience incarceration 3 times more than heterosexual people. Over 40% of incarcerated women identify as non-heterosexual. 1 in 6 trans people have experienced incarceration, with almost a half of Black trans people experiencing incarceration at some point in their lives. Furthermore, LGBTQ youth make up about 15% of youth in the juvenile legal system. And again, if you want more information, I can go into more about the causes of these disparities during the Q&A. So lastly for me, I want to talk about how these disparities specifically play out in schools, both in other research and in my own research. So research has shown, both CJ Pascoe's work that I mentioned earlier about gendered homophobia, and my own work and other work about gender and sexuality in schools, that there's often a hidden curriculum or unintended lessons about heterosexuality and the gender binary that unfold in schools. In that, disciplinary practices, school curricula, student-teacher relationships, school events such as prom, often uphold heterosexuality in the gender binary as normal, natural, and correct. For example, in my own study, a teacher punished a Black trans woman because she wore makeup to school. The teacher made her remove her makeup, and then she gave her a tardy pass for being late from removing her makeup, which then sent her to on-campus intervention for the day. In this way, hidden curricula and school regulations can further legitimize the disciplining of LGBTQ young people. Also, since LGBTQ young people are often challenging heterosexuality as the norm and challenging the gender binary, bullying is often a common experience of their social life, as bullying is often about policing gender and sexuality for many youth. And even if LGBTQ youth do not experience bullying, the fear of experiencing it can still shape how they behave in schools. So LGBTQ youth may alter their appearance and behaviors and or conceal their gender and or sexual identity as a way to try to avoid the experience of bullying. And race can further compound this, as both teachers, administrators, and peers might surveil the gender and sexual behaviors of Black and brown people more because of how racism we know shapes policing and surveillance practices in this country. And one kind of thing that I uncovered in my own work and that other work about the school to prison pipeline is showing is that many LGBTQ youth often, when they fight back against their bullies, a consequence for fighting back is that they might get sent to alternative educational institutions or to jails. So in a recent national study, found that LGBT youth, particularly gender expansive girls, are up to 3 times more likely to experience disciplinary treatment at schools compared to their non-LGBT counterparts, even though they were not engaging in more bad, quote unquote, bad or deemed deviant behaviors as that might be seen by teachers or administrators. But instead, when LGBTQ youth fight back against their bullies, school authorities often blame and punish them for their own victimization, presuming their guilt instead of recognizing that they are trying to protect themselves. These authorities also fail to recognize how gender policing and anti-LGBTQ discrimination produce bullies to target LGBTQ youth and why the LGBTQ youth are fighting back. And that structural causes basically become a race in how we're dealing with bullying at school. And that this kind of failure to understand these structural causes are often pushing LGBTQ youth, especially LGBTQ youth of color, out of schools and into jails and into homelessness. So schools actually become an institution that is contributing to why LGBTQ youth disproportionately are making up youth in the juvenile legal systems and in the youth homelessness population. So I will now turn it back to Alex, who's going to delve more into kind of trans experiences.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brandon, for that. You speak so well. It's always good to hear you speak on these issues because they're so important. So let's get into the meat and bones of things. Let's talk about the do's and don'ts for interacting with trans folks. So I won't go into all of these totally in depth, but all of this information is more so for any trans person, not just trans youth or trans students. And so take all of this information to kind of apply outward for your life rather than just for trans students. But some of these are very applicable for our students as well. And so in this case, not asking a trans person dead name is super important, but unfortunately for a lot of youth, they're unable to change their name and gender marker at a young age. So in this case, I would say go ahead and ask the youth what their preferred name is and use that name. It's important for them to feel validated in their name. When I chose my own name, I was really excited about it, and it was it started a new life for me. It was really important to have that and to move on in a clear way. And at that point, once I got my name and gender marker changed, my birth name was no longer my name. It was a reminder of my painful past and not something that I wanted to acknowledge at that point any further. And so we don't want to ask a trans person or LGBTQ person how they have sex, and we don't want to ask what's in their pants. So this is, a wildly inappropriate question that hopefully nobody is asking anybody, especially our students, because that is kind of a safety concern in my opinion. And so with that, I'll kind of move on down the line. We don't want to assume anyone's pronouns. So if they look, talk, act a certain way, it does not mean their pronouns are as follows. It's important to ask that question. Easy way to ask someone's pronouns is by saying, hey, what are your pronouns? Just like I did in the beginning of this session. And we don't want to out them without their consent, even if they're open. So like my story beforehand, it's so incredibly important that we don't out our youth, especially, our LGBTQ youth. We don't want to put them in potential danger, like I was put in, or like my little sister was put in, and like many other LGBTQ people who've been outed by school staff members, school nurses, what have you. And so youth being outed is a serious issue that teachers, school staff members, people working in the school system can not think twice about, like they could be like, oh, this youth is super flamboyant about their identity. They're super proud of their identity. Why wouldn't their parents know? We need to think about that whenever we're interacting with our youth very carefully, because this could impact youth for the rest of their life, like it did for me. We don't want to make a problem about ourselves Everyone makes mistakes. Things happen. I misgender people on occasion. The easiest thing to do is to immediately correct yourself and graciously move on with the conversation, which I'll kind of go into. But in this case, it's important that when you're interacting with a trans person or a trans student, if you make a slip up, if you dead name them, or if you use the incorrect pronouns, then instead of being like, oh no, I'm so sorry, I had no idea, I just felt like, and I won't do it ever again, that makes it uncomfortable for everyone involved, especially if they're in a group setting, because at that point you're kind of outing them even at that point, and so it's important just to say sorry, blank, move on. But we'll talk about that more in just a second. So we do want to ask them their pronouns and respect them. What I really like, what makes me really happy, is whenever someone opens up a conversation asking me my pronouns, or even introducing the question by saying, hey, my pronouns are blank blank. What are your pronouns? That's a really easy, safe way to validate a trans person. But it is absolutely crucial that once you receive their pronouns, that you then respect them. There was a time when I was in the doctor's office, and this is probably a year ago, and I was still a baby trans and I didn't have a beard, but I had changed my name and gender marker, and this clinic wasn't necessarily nice to me, but I needed to go to the doctor. So I go into the doctor's office, and this woman is like, hi, I see that you recently changed your name. What are your pronouns? And I was like, yes. This person respects me. And I was like, my pronouns are he, him. What are your pronouns? And she is she, her. And I say, great. And so we go on about the doctor's appointment. And then whenever we go about to meeting the x-ray tech and the phlebotomist, she then proceeded to only misgender me and only use the wrong pronouns. And then, that outed me to the phlebotomist, the x-ray tech, and the other people who were in the area. Very disheartening. Just thinking about it now kind of like starts to give me anxiety, because if you're going to ask someone's pronouns, it's so important that you follow through and respect those pronouns. And then the next one, asking how to refer to their body parts, not necessarily important unless you are a nurse in the school system. Often nurses, they go about things not thinking twice, but it's important to make sure that youth are respected, even in how they refer to their body parts. But this isn't something you'll run into, all the time. We want to correct others if they're misgendered and in a safe environment. So we want to be aware to not out them if, in an unsafe environment, like if a youth is interacting with their parents and the parent misgenders the youth. We want to make sure we ask the youth if it's okay to correct them. However, it could still bring danger upon the student. And so we want to make sure that we're pretty careful about this one. But if we're a staff member and we're talking about a youth and another staff member misgenders them, misnames them, what have you, it's important to correct that staff member to make sure that we are being consistent across the board in the respect for these youth. And we want to be supportive on how these youth present themselves. If someone says their pronouns are he, him, and they dress very femininely, then we respect that. If someone dresses a certain way and it doesn't necessarily, in your mind, align with their gender identity, then it's still important to respect those pronouns. I personally, I'm a makeup artist. I've done makeup for the past 10 years. I'm so passionate about makeup. I love it. And I definitely I'm a more feminine person. I've more so embraced my femininity as I transitioned, but that has no reflection on how I identify. I use the same pronouns, and I hope to be respected as male as I am. Whenever you're running into issues, you want to correct yourself and graciously move on if a slip up occurs. So I'll kind of model what this conversation should look like. So say John is going to the grocery store and you're telling someone about John going to the grocery store, and you say, yeah, John, she is going to the grocery store and she's going to get some milk or whatever. So at that point, it's important for you to just immediately correct that, that misgender and move on quickly and then just carry on the conversation. Or you could say, yeah, John, she went to the store, sorry, to get some milk and a bag of chips. That is a great way to just correct yourself, move on, try not to get too in your head about it, especially in the heat of the moment, because that sort of like feeling can easily be reflected on the student or the trans person and can cause this weird awkwardness. So that immediate correction is super important as well. So moving on, if my screen will load, let's go ahead and review some stuff. First, I invite you all to take a collective deep breath. We talked about a lot today so far, and we still have quite a ways to go. And so I want to kind of open up the conversation even more so and see what you guys are thinking. So I ask you guys to type in the chat what information thus far has been new for you. What of the information provided has been helpful for you? And is there anything you need clarification on? So I ask you guys to open up in that chat, and maybe Brandon can help me look through that chat and give me some feedback if you guys have any questions thus far. And I think I'll wait like a minute and a half for that.
I saw one question so far from Jamie, who asked about how to refer to their non-binary child, but not saying my child, as their child is now an adult. I don't fully have the answer to that. I guess you could say I'm the parent of so-and-so, but though they still might think that then the person's not an adult. Or you could say I'm the parent of so-and-so who is this age. I mean, child is a gender neutral term, though I also understand the kind of problem that you're butting heads against is that it seems infantilizing. So maybe saying the parent of might work better, or you can just clarify that you're the parent of someone who's now an adult. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the best that I can think of, unless you have any other ideas, Alex.
Yeah, I think that sounds good to me. Personally, my mom calls me her brood, which I kind of think is gross, but I think it's funny too because it's gender neutral. And so she'll just, say her kids, these are my kids, even though they're not kids. Like, I'm sure every other parent would understand exactly what you mean by that, even if they're 30 years old, So yeah, that's my input. That's a good question though. Anything else that we have?
I can jump in real quick and just say that folks are saying that the new things they learned were gender expansive identities. Somebody said all of the new definitions and a lot of the terms. So I think that folks are definitely learning a lot. And we also have one question. Any suggestions on the best way to approach staff/teachers that resist using a student's preferred pronoun? Sometimes students are met with resistance on this. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Brandon, do you wanna start this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I might come from a little utopic vision. To me, if you're a teacher, you should care about your children. I would hope that most people that became teachers because they care about the young people in our society. And so I mean, for me, it would just be like try to approach the teacher or staff from a place of like caring about the youth's well-being, and that misgendering a child or youth can actually have severe mental and physical health consequences. I mean, I would try to approach the staff or teacher first and just try to meet them at their level and where they're at. Maybe also try to find out why they're being resistant and try to maybe work through where their resistance comes from. But if they're within a larger institution that has rules, then maybe you can also turn to administrators to also help, Or if you don't want to point out the staff or teacher, maybe you can get the entire teachers and staff to do like an LGBTQ workshop. So you're not just targeting that teacher. And so then they have a space where all of you can work through LGBTQ sensitivity training or something like that. So those are, I guess, a few things that come to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful, Brandon. Thank you for, talking on those points. I think that for, making sure that the staff is educated across the board is the ideal scene. I have in my references and in the files, you can see the GLSEN Safe Space textbook where they provide really helpful information for teachers and staff. I think it's more so important to make sure that that teacher is educated on the repercussions of misgendering a youth. And I will be totally honest with you guys at this point. Preparing for this whole workshop really made me kind of look inward and try to remember what it was like being queer growing up in school. And it brought back a lot of trauma memories. And I often found myself being a little bit overwhelmed because I remembered all the things that I had gone through in my youth. And last night I was at Dairy Queen and I was in the drive-thru and I was like having issues ordering because I was just out of it, and I kept getting misgendered. The person kept calling me ma'am, and that is something that just it's very frustrating, but it's hard when you don't see someone. But in the same token, it's something that a trans person goes through relatively often. And that night, last night was a point when it really, really deeply impacted me. And so you need to take the knowledge that your youth, that teacher or staff member misgendering them could set them off. It could really harm them in a deep way, especially if they're dealing with stuff at home regarding their identity. It's so important that all of the staff is educated on this topic. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and move on from the questions. If you have further questions, we can kind of talk about this in the Q&A moving forward. But I did want to touch on a topic that is very important to me, something that I haven't had the opportunity to share on, but I think is very, very important to talk about, especially in these days. And that's on survival sex. So for those who don't know about survival sex, it would be, youth who engage in survival sex are youth who exchange sex for money, material goods, whether that be shelter, food, and or drugs. And so this is something that I engaged with throughout my youth from my freshman year of high school on up. And I wanted to go into the statistics on survival sex, but first I wanted to mention there is something in the file as well as in the references and referrals, a link to a wonderful study that was done in New York on LGBTQ youth engaging in survival sex and just youth engaging in survival sex in general, as well as how to identify youth engaging in survival sex. So please take that, give that a look, and we'll go on with this. So youth reported experiences of social and familial discrimination, rejection, familial dysfunction, familial poverty, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, emotional and mental trauma. All of those things aren't good. They don't sound good, but these are all the things that kind of lead a person into having to engage in this activity. Young people might be recruited by an exploiter, but eventually trade independently to meet their basic needs. And so they could be recruited by an exploiter like I was in the very beginning, but at that point they realize it works. It does give them the shelter, food, and drugs that they need to get through it. So they then kind of go on to independently engaging it themselves and seeking it out. Youth experience violence and abuse from multiple sources, including families, exploiters, clients, strangers, peers, and law enforcement. Youth also experience violence at the hands of staff and clients at social service organizations and or locations that are intended to be safe. There's a trans group that I am involved with at Out Youth, and I've had several other trans folks talk to me about being assaulted in a shelter or a location that's supposed to be safe because they were engaging in survival sex. Either they had clients in the shelter or the staff members felt that they could put their hands on them because they were so used to it. Things like that I've seen relatively often with my even just in the small connection of my other trans friends. And LGBTQ youth tend to have large peer networks, which include youth who engage in survival sex. Many young people are introduced to the survival sex economy through social networks. So for me, it was a quick trip on dating apps, finding out that this was something that was actively happening. I saw it was happening. I saw that it was working. And so I continued to do it even, after the time that I got out of high school to survive. I went up to Austin when I was 17 years old. And so at that point, it was just seeing what other queer people were doing and then doing that as well. Another point that I was going to talk on, but I totally forgot. So I hope it gets to my mind. But yeah, super important topic. And so with all of that, I want to go into the safety for youth. So for bathroom policies tends to be a topic of great discussion, especially in the past couple years on, discussing trans issues. The bathroom issue has always been a problem. So for bathroom policies, I say best practice, ask the youth where they want to go. Ask the youth how they're comfortable, what restroom they would like to go in. It is totally up to them to make that decision at their point. If I, was, if I was in high school and I went into the men's restroom when I was in high school, I would have got beaten up. I knew that was certain because I've seen other people walk out of that bathroom with bloody noses. And that was something that I often ran into throughout, my high school, and then as well as going on and like growing up and even going to bars, trans women going into the men's restroom. They would come out and all disheveled and they were assaulted. It was something that I saw actively. It's something that is happening. And so the safety concern is mostly for the trans people themselves, because the people, if you're forced to go into a restroom you're not comfortable with, it can open up so many different issues for that trans person. And so it's important to ask them where they want to go. And that kind of leads me into the next conversation, which is safety doesn't look like isolation. Now in this experience, segregation of LGBTQ youth can further traumatize the youth. There was one point in my life, and I was incarcerated, and I was asked which like group of people I wanted to go with, the men or the women, which was socially accepting. But as soon as I was in that men's facility, I was put into isolation. I was in a locked room, no window. I wasn't given any food, and I was totally isolated from everybody in that community. And that was a really hard thing for me to go through. And it, wasn't, at that point, they were locking me away from my safety, which, kind of just says how messed up the system can be, and how we isolate these youth. And so that's why it's so important to normalize LGBTQ experiences rather than isolate them. We don't want to hide them. We want to normalize these experiences so that at that point, safety concerns are no longer an issue. In an ideal world, we can just normalize all experiences of all people. And so we also want to prepare a safe space for LGBTQ youth to rely on. So the first shelter that I had gone to was a Salvation Army. And as soon as I walked up there, they turned me away. They said, we don't have enough beds for you. It won't work. And then I saw 5 more people walk into that shelter, and then they had beds. And so that was kind of my experience immediately going into this, like the scene of Austin. I was in downtown on 6th, and I was turned away from everyone. And I was just like, okay, well, I can't live in the shelter, so I'm going to live in my car in the heat of July, August, September. And that was the hottest summer of my life, was the first year of homelessness. And I eventually found a place called LifeWorks, and that building had a big, huge rainbow flag in the front of the door. And as soon as I walked in, I shed a couple tears. I was just like, okay, like now what, I'm here now. And they just welcomed me with open arms. And that's when I, got into that transitional living program, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But just seeing that there was a visual sign that I was safe and welcomed was so meaningful for me. I also remember my 8th grade teacher, she had this big old rainbow pencil in her desk, and I remember like asking her about it, and she was just like, I just like to make sure that, people have enough pencils and they feel good and they feel comfortable, in a really like secretive way, trying to say that she was an ally. And that made me feel really good. Like a rainbow pencil changed the way I viewed this teacher. And so looking at like how you guys treat your youth, having signs that a place is safe and open is so important for these youth to feel welcome. And we want to be genuine and consistent. So we want to ensure that youth are supported wholeheartedly and get feedback from youth on how to further provide support. We want to inform youth of what protections there are to assure safety and how to confidentially report any problems. So we want to make sure that we're being consistent. And this is hard in school because, different teachers have different, views on the world, and the teachers are their own person. But again, it's so important that the staff of the schools are educated on how to treat these youth, because I could have 5 supportive teachers, but I could have 3 unsupportive teachers. And those teachers, the unsupportive teachers, could totally impact the way I view school in general, which was the case. I had a couple teachers who were super supportive, were like always willing to let me talk to them. And then I had those teachers who would walk up to me and my girlfriend and rip our hands apart and have us go to the principal's office for insubordination. And so those things are, just to be important to keep in mind, especially as we're working with our students. And you might be the only safe space for a youth. You might be that only teacher who makes a person feel welcome or safe. And so it's important to be consistent with that support all across the board. And so let's go into best practices now. How do we ensure these youth are more welcome? We want to listen. We want to listen. Like all LGBTQ students, or like all people, they need to feel heard. They need to be comfortable in expressing themselves. So we want to take that time to hear them out. And with that, I'll go into a personal story that always makes me feel really good inside. I was at my very first Pride in Austin, and there was a mom, and I had my trans pride flag on the barricade, and I was just like this little trans boy just waiting, watching the floats go by, totally like overwhelmed with love and acceptance. And there was a mom walking, and she had a sign out that says, "I love my trans son." And at that point, I'd never seen anyone, say anything like that. I've never seen anything in my life that was like accepting, like a mom accepting her son. And I remember locking eyes with that mom, and she just saw me. She saw right through me, and she ran up to me, and she gave me the biggest bear hug over that barricade. And that was the moment that I felt truly loved and accepted for who I was by a complete stranger. And that was particularly very, very powerful for me. And so as we go on to that, we want to talk about avoiding talking about your own personal experiences, even though I just shared my own personal experience. But the reference that I'm talking about is whenever we're talking with our LGBTQ youth, so often, honestly, pretty much every time I disclose that I'm trans, is you get someone else saying, "Oh, I have a trans brother, and yeah, they're pretty cool. He's like 17 or 18, she's like 17 or 18. Like, it's just a really awkward conversation. And it's, even though you're trying to relate to a youth and you're trying to provide your, just support, you could do that in a really almost re-traumatizing type of way. And so it's important to avoid talking about yourself and just letting that person talk. And so with that, we want to talk about being a role model of acceptance. It's important to, then at that point, sorry guys, the thing went by. Okay, so it looks like we are almost out of time, but I do kind of want to wrap this conversation up really quickly. It's important to respect LGBTQ youth, see them for who they are, keep up with the lingo. It's so important to just care for these youth because you might be the only person caring for them. And so, you know, with that, we're so out of time and I apologize for going, you know, off the hinges. I want to provide these references and referrals here. And if you have any questions moving forward, you can put your email and I can respond with, you know, the answers to those questions. If you have specific questions, you can reach out to me or Brandon and we can provide you with information on that as well. So thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was amazing. A lot of really great information. It sounds like folks, including me, learned a ton. We do have a couple more questions. So, you know, potentially you could just provide some answers in the chat when you're able to do that. So thank you to everyone who asked questions and participated and, you know, sat in on this presentation. I just want to remind everyone that there's a survey link on this session's page in the virtual platform. So if you could take the survey, that's important for your CEU credit. And it does sound like a couple of people were having some issues with the files that were added for this presentation. So I'll be working with the presenters to make sure we get those files updated for y'all. All right, well, thank you so much, Alex and Brandon. This was wonderful. And yeah, everyone have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.